People remembered the day he started digging more clearly than they remembered most things, maybe because it did. T makes sense right from the beginning. It was late autumn, the kind where the air already hinted at snow even though the ground was still bare enough to work. Leaves had turned brittle and brown, crunching under boots, and the sky stayed a dull gray for days at a time. That was when he marked out the ground behind his small cabin and began cutting into it with a shovel that looked older than some of the houses in town. At first, nobody paid much attention. Around here, people were used to odd projects that never quite went anywhere. A half-built shed abandoned after one weekend. A new fence line that stopped suddenly for no clear reason. Folks started things all the time. Finishing them was another matter. But after a few days, people noticed T digging randomly. The hole had straight edges. The measurements were careful. Stakes were placed with intention. Whatever he was doing, it wasn't a whim. The cabin itself had been there longer than most of the newer homes. It sat low to the ground, built solid and plain, with thick logs and a roof that had seen better years. He bought it cheap, fixed what mattered, and ignored what did. No one ever accused him of trying to impress anyone. That is partly why the new project caught people off guard. A man like him did, to usually take on something big without a reason. The first comment came from a neighbor driving by in a pickup, slowing down just enough to lean out the window and call, "You building a basement now?" It was said with a laugh, the friendly kind that expected a joke in return. He just nodded once and went back to shoveling. The truck rolled on, laughter trailing behind it. By the end of the week, the hole had deepened, and stacks of lumber appeared nearby. Not scrap wood, not leftovers, but thick beams cleanly cut, stacked with care. That is when the question started changing tone. Lumber like that one's cheap, and it wasn't used for basements. It was barn wood, heavy posts, roof trusses, the kind meant to stand tall and open, not buried behind a cabin. People began stopping on purpose. They leaned against their trucks, hands shoved into jacket pockets, watching him work. He paused only long enough to wipe sweat from his brow or straighten his back, then returned to the task. Someone finally asked the question everyone was thinking. "You putting a barn back there?" He looked up, considered the hole of the beams, the cabin behind him, and said, "Something like that." That answer alone was enough to spark laughter. A barn behind the cabin did make much sense to begin with. A barn over it made even less. The rumor spread faster than the truth usually did. By the time it reached the general store, the story had grown. He was building a barn on top of his house. He lost his mind. He was trying some city idea that would. Last one winter. Winter around here was the final judge of all things. As days passed, the digging stopped and the framing began. Posts went in, sunk deep, and anchored solidly. They weren't placed randomly either. They lined up with the cabin, as footprint, forming a perimeter that wrapped around it without touching the walls. The spacing was precise, the angles clean. Anyone who knew construction could see that at least one thing was certain. He knew what he was doing with wood. That only made it stranger. The laughter grew louder once the frame started rising. From the road, it looked absurd tall posts towering over a modest cabin, like scaffolding for a building that did. Belonged there. People joked that he was building himself a wooden cage. Others said it looked like the skeleton of a giant animal looming protectively over a much smaller one. Someone claimed he was trying to cheat snow somehow. That one earned the most laughs. Snow could be cheated. Snow piled where it wanted, crushed what it pleased, and froze everything it touched. Everyone knew that. Roofs collapsed every few years if they weren't. Shoveled in time. Men fell off ladders every winter trying to keep ahead of it. Snow demanded work. There was no way around that. But he worked like a man who believed otherwise. Each beam was lifted carefully, braced securely, checked twice before being fixed in place. He worked alone most days, though once or twice a friend stopped by to help lift a heavier piece. Even then, there wasn't much talking, no explaining, no defending the idea, just steady progress. By late November, the outline of the barn was undeniable. High above the cabin roof, a wide-open structure took shape. The pitch of the roof was steep, steeper than most barns in the area. People noticed that too. Steep roofs meant snow slid fast, sometimes dangerously so. Folks usually preferred a balanced enough pitch to shed some snow, not so much that it came down all at once. His design ignored that unspoken rule completely. "Looks like he wants an avalanche," someone joked. Another replied, "Good. Maybe I'll take the whole thing with it." They laughed, but there was an edge to it now. Not cruelty exactly, more like discomfort. The kind that comes when someone breaks a rule everyone else has followed without question. The day the first snowfall came, light and quiet, people watched closely. Snow dusted the ground, the roads, the rooftops. On his property it settled briefly on the half-finished barn roof, then slid off in thin sheets, whispering as it hit the ground below. No one commented on that. It was early yet. Nothing had been tested. Still, when he climbed down from the ladder that evening and stood back to look at his work, there was something calm about him. Not pride, not defiance. Just certainty. That night, at the local diner, his name came up again. Someone said he was wasting money. Someone else said he'd regret it when the real storms hit. Another said maybe he was onto something. But that comment did get much agreement. Around here, innovation was treated like a guest who hadn't been invited. You tolerated it maybe, but you did trust it. By the time December loomed close, the barn roof was nearly complete. Wide panels locked into place, forming a shield over the cabin that left a clear air gap between roof and roof. From certain angles, you could see daylight between them. People shook their heads at that detail most of all. Cold air would just pour in, they said. Heat would escape. It made no sense. He heard all of it. None of it slowed him down. The last day of work before the ground froze solid, he finished tightening the final bolts and climbed down slowly, joints stiff, hands rough and red. He stood in the fading light, the barn towering above his modest home, snow clouds gathering on the horizon. It looked strange, unbalanced, almost foolish. From the road, a neighbor paused, engine idling, window down. "You really think that thing is going to save you work this winter?" he asked, not unkindly but not hiding his doubt. He looked up at the structure once more before answering. "I don't think," he said. "I planned." The truck drove on. Laughter followed him again, lighter this time, less certain. Winter was coming, and everyone believed they already knew how this story ended. They'd seen enough bad ideas fail under heavy snow to feel confident in their judgment. What they did. To know what no one could quite see yet was that this one's a story about building more. It was a story about doing less, about letting gravity, space, and patience replace effort. But for now, all they saw was a barn where a barn did. Belong, standing awkwardly over cabin, daring winter to prove them right. Winter did announce itself with drama that year. It arrived the way it often did, quietly, persistently, as if testing whether anyone was paying attention. Mornings grew sharper. Breath lingered longer in the air. The ground hardened just enough to remind people that soon it would be unmovable. Most folks shifted into familiar routines, stacking firewood closer to the door, sealing windows with plastic, pulling heavy coats out of storage. He did those things too, but his focus stayed fixed upward on the growing frame above his cabin. By the time December, as first week rolled around, the barn skeleton was complete. Thick posts stood like sentinels around the cabin, their bases buried deep, their tops reaching far higher than any roof nearby. Crossbeams tied everything together, locking the structure into a rigid shape that did sway even when the wind picked up. People driving past slowed down without realizing it, eyes drawn to the odd silhouette against the gray sky. It wasn't just unusual anymore. It was imposing. That's when the comments changed again. At the hardware store, someone said, "He's not stopping, is he?" Another replied, "Looks like he's doubling down." The idea that someone would commit fully to something so unconventional unsettled people more than the idea itself. Half-finished mistakes were easy to laugh at. Finished ones demanded a verdict. He began working higher now, climbing ladders with steady patience, hauling boards up one at a time. The roof trusses were massive, heavier than most people would dare handle alone. When a neighbor finally offered help, he accepted without fuss. They worked side by side in near silence, lifting, bracing, securing. From up there, you could see the whole valley, roofs already dusted with frost, chimneys beginning to smoke in the early evenings. "You sure about this?" the neighbor asked at one point, resting his weight against a beam. He tightened a bolt and nodded. "Been sure a long time." That answer lingered. The roof pitch became the subject of endless speculation. It was steep, so steep it looked exaggerated, almost cartoonish. People joked that he built it for mountains, not flat land. Others said snow would come down so fast it bury him alive. Someone even warned him, half serious, that sliding snow could take out the posts if enough weight came down at once. He listened. He always listened, then he kept building exactly the same way. What people did at sea was the planning that had gone into every angle, the way the pitch aligned with prevailing winds, the way the overhangs extended just far enough to push falling snow away from the cabin walls, the way the posts were spaced to distribute weight downward instead of inward. None of it was accidental. None of it was borrowed blindly from someone else. As design. It was the result of years spent watching winters do damage, remembering where ice formed, where snow piled, where heat escaped. The first real snowfall came on a Tuesday night. Not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to coat everything evenly. By morning, the town looked softer, quieter. Tires crunched instead of hummed. Doors stuck just a little. People stepped outside with shovels already in hand, more out of habit than necessity. At his place, snow dusted the barn roof briefly before sliding down in thin, whispering sheets. It collected around the perimeter in neat piles, leaving the space beneath oddly untouched. The cabin roof below stayed almost bare, shaded and protected. He noticed it, of course, but he did linger. It was still early. Proof meant nothing yet. Word spread anyway. Snow won't even stay up there, someone said. Just wait till it. As real snow. And real snow did come. By mid-December, storms rolled through one after another. The kind that filled ditches overnight and erased fence lines. Roofs disappeared under white weight. People woke early before work to shovel paths and clear porches. Ladders appeared along rooftops like seasonal decorations. The rhythm of winter labor returned in full force, except at his place. From the road, it was impossible not to notice the contrast. Snow piled thick everywhere else, but around his cabin the entrance stayed clear. The barn roof shed snow constantly, quietly, in controlled slides that fell where he planned for them to fall. There was no dramatic crash, no dangerous avalanche, just gravity doing its job again and again. People started driving by more often. Not to laugh now, but to look. One morning, a neighbor stopped outright, shovel still resting in the truck bed. "You been up shoveling already?" he asked. He shook his head. "Not once." The neighbor frowned, glanced up at the roof, then back at his own snow-covered house down the road. He did say anything else. He did need to. Still, skepticism held on. Winter was long. Everyone knew that early victories meant nothing. Snow got heavier. Ice came next. Wind tested joints. Cold found every weakness eventually. People told themselves it was too soon to judge. Inside the cabin, the difference was already noticeable. The air felt steadier, less drafty. The temperature did swing as wildly overnight. He burned less wood without trying to. Heat rose, met the insulated barrier of space and structure above, and settled back down instead of escaping into the open sky. The barn trapped cold air where it belonged outside, above, harmless. He did brag about any of this. He did invite people in to feel the warmth. He let winter do the explaining. Mid-month, a storm hit hard enough to shut down roads. Snow came sideways, driven by wind that howled through trees and rattled loose boards across town. Roofs groaned. People checked attics with flashlights, listening for cracks that meant trouble. Some climbed up anyway despite the danger, because doing nothing felt worse. That night, lights stayed on late at his place. Not because of worry, but because he was reading by the window, watching the storm. Snow hit the barn roof and slid off almost immediately, never lingering long enough to build dangerous weight. The structure did creak. It did complain. It simply stood. The next morning, the difference was impossible to ignore. His driveway was passable. His door opened easily. No shovel marks lined the steps. Meanwhile, across town, people were exhausted before noon. At the diner, conversation shifted again. The jokes were gone now. In their place were quieter statements. Maybe he knew something. That Rufus doing all the work. Haven't seen him shovel once. Someone finally said it out loud. He built a barn over his cabin. The sentence hung there, heavier than left or ever had. People began noticing smaller details too. The way ice never formed along his eaves. The way meltwater drained cleanly away, instead of refreezing into hazards. The way his place looked the same day after day, untouched by storms that battered everything else. A few neighbors stopped by with questions framed as casual conversation. How deep were the posts set? Why leave that much space between roofs? Did the barn catch more wind? He answered honestly, simply, without overselling. He talked about airflow, about snow load, about letting problems pass overhead instead of fighting them head-on. Some listened carefully. Others nodded politely and left unconvinced. Changing a lifetime of habits took more than one winter. Still, something had shifted. Where once people laughed openly, now they watched quietly. Where once they predicted failure, now they waited. Winter wanzed, over. February still loomed. The worst storms often came late. Everyone knew that. If his idea failed, it would fail then. But as December wore on, one thing became undeniable. He was shoveling snow. Not from his roof, not from his doorway, not from his steps. While others measured winter in sore backs and split knuckles, he measured it in calm mornings and steady warmth. The barn above his cabin did just block snow. It changed the rules of the season for him, and for the first time, people wondered not if he made a mistake, but if they had. By the time January arrived, winter had settled in fully, the way it always did when it decided it was done playing around. The cold sharpened overnight, biting deeper, lingering longer. Snowbanks hardened into pale walls along roads, and the soft quiet of early winter gave way to a heavier silence, the kind that pressed down on everything. This was the point in the season when optimism usually ran out. People stopped talking about getting through winter and started talking about enduring it. January was when things broke. Everyone knew it. Pipes froze, roofs sagged, doors swelled and refused to open without force. Snow that had seemed manageable in December became compacted, icy, and stubborn. Shovels scraped uselessly against it. Snow blowers clogged and coughed. The novelty of winter labor vanished, replaced by routine exhaustion. For years, this had been the month when neighbors measured one another quietly. Who was keeping up? Who looked worn down? Who had shoveled their roof recently enough? It was unspoken, but everyone watched. And now, everyone watched him. The storms came heavier now, no longer dustings or polite overnight blankets. They arrived in thick waves that lasted hours, sometimes days. Snow fell straight down at first, then sideways, driven by wind that rattled windows and bent trees into uneasy shapes. Visibility vanished. Roads disappeared under constant accumulation, plows fighting a losing battle. On most properties, snow stayed where it landed. Roofs collected it layer by layer, each storm adding weight to what was already there. Icicles grew longer, heavier, like warnings hanging from the eaves. Inside houses, heaters ran nonstop, struggling against drafts that crept in through every tiny weakness. At his place, the pattern was different. From the road, it was easy to tell where his property began. Snow piled deep around the barn posts, forming soft, sloping mounds that grew taller with every storm. Above them, the barn roof remained strangely bare, or at least never white for long. Snow would land, hesitate for a moment, then slide away in long, controlled sheets, whispering as they fell. There was no dramatic crash, no thunderous collapse. Just quiet movement, over and over, day after day. Beneath it all, the cabin roof stayed clear, shaded, untouched. The space between the two roofs, so heavily criticized in the fall, proved to be exactly what he needed. Cold air pooled there, trapped and harmless. Wind rushed over the barn roof and moved on, never finding a way inside. Heat from the cabin rose, slowed, and settled back down instead of bleeding into the sky. He noticed the difference most in the mornings. While others woke early to shovel paths and chip ice before work, he woke to stillness. His door opened easily. His steps were clear. Snow lay everywhere else, but never where he needed to walk. He brewed coffee without rushing, watching the steam curl upward in the cold light, listening to the low sound of wind passing overhead instead of battering his walls. He did feel triumphant. He felt relieved. Relief was a quiet thing, and it did announce itself loudly enough for others to notice right away. But over time, it showed. He moved more easily. His shoulders stayed loose instead of tight with constant strain. His hands, though rough, weren't cracked raw from hours of shoveling. Winter was still winter, but it wasn't fighting him anymore. Elsewhere, frustration mounted. One neighbor slipped off a ladder while clearing snow from his roof and bruised his ribs badly enough to miss work for a week. Another found a slow leak in the attic, where melting snow had refrozen and backed water under shingles. Repairs were made in freezing temperatures, fingers numb, tempers short. Everyone had a story by now, and none of them were good. At the diner, conversation grew heavier. People complained openly now, no longer laughing about the cold but cursing it. They compared heating bills, injuries, close calls. Someone mentioned that they hadn't seen him out shoveling at all, not once, someone said. Not even after that last storm. That can be right, another replied. Nobody gets away with that. But he was. People began driving past more slowly, not even pretending anymore. They stared openly at the barn roof, at the clean lines where snow never lingered, at the way the piles formed exactly where they should and nowhere else. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was disbelief. One afternoon, after a storm that dumped nearly 2 feet overnight, a neighbor finally pulled in and walked up the cleared path to his door. Snow crunched under boots everywhere else, but not there. "How much did you shovel this morning?" the neighbor asked, not bothering with small talk. "None," he said. The neighbor looked up, then around, then back at him. "Roof?" "None." That word carried weight. They stood there in silence for a moment, wind passing overhead, snow sliding softly off the barn roof behind them. The neighbor shook his head slowly. "I was up there for 2 hours," he said. "Thought I was going to freeze solid." He nodded, not smug, not apologetic, just understanding. Inside, the cabin felt different too. The temperature stayed steady, even during the coldest nights. He noticed he was waking up to cold floors or icy drafts along the walls. The fire burned slower. Wood lasted longer. It was magic, it was physics, but it felt like magic to anyone who hadn't seen it coming. That space above the cabin did more than shed snow. It acted like a buffer zone, absorbing cold before it could reach the living space. During the day, the barn structure caught weak winter sunlight, warming slightly, just enough to temper the air trapped beneath it. At night, it slowed heat loss, keeping warmth from escaping too quickly. Others felt the cold creep in every evening. He felt it hover, held at bay. By mid-January, storms stacked up one after another. There was no time between them anymore, no chance to catch up. Snowbanks along roads grew taller than cars. Mailboxes vanished. The town looked smaller, tighter, buried. That's when roofs started failing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. A sag here, a crack there. People noticed ceilings bowing slightly, heard unfamiliar creaks in the night. Anxiety crept in. More ladders came out. More risky climbs onto icy slopes. At his place, the barn roof never held enough snow long enough to complain. Weight was never allowed to build. What fell quickly and predictably, away from anything that mattered. Someone finally said what had been hovering unspoken for weeks. He built himself out of winter. The sentence spread. It was envy, exactly. It was something closer to recognition. The realization that winter did have to be a constant battle if you stopped fighting it head-on and instead redirected it. Most people built defenses that resisted snow. He built something that refused to carry it at all. One evening after another long storm, he stood outside briefly looking up. Snow slid off in long ribbons, piling quietly below. The sound was almost soothing. He thought about all the winters he'd spent shoveling roofs, about ladders slipping, about the constant tension of waiting for the next storm. He hadn't eliminated winter. He simply stepped out of its way. Neighbors noticed his calm even more than his roof. While others moved stiffly, sore and tired, he walked easily. While others spoke in clipped tones, he listened patiently. Winter had drained them. It hadn't drained him. By the end of January, no one laughed anymore, not even quietly. The barn over the cabin had become a fact, as solid and undeniable as the snow itself. People still did fully understand it, but they respected it now. And some of them, those who paid close attention, had already started sketching ideas of their own, wondering how many winters they'd spent doing things the hard way when another way had been standing in plain sight all along. February arrived without apology. It did, to ease its way in or give anyone time to recover from January's punishment. It came cold, heavy, and relentless, as if winter itself had decided to prove a point. The sun showed up less often now, and when it did, it felt distant and weak, more like a rumor than a presence. Nights stretched longer, and the cold sank deeper, settling into bones, into wood, into everything people thought they'd already prepared. This was the month people feared. February was when winter stopped testing and started enforcing. Snow that had fallen earlier hardened into ice-packed layers that refused to move. Roofs that had survived January now carried weeks of accumulated weight. Shoveling became less about clearing and more about survival. Every task took longer. Every mistake carried consequences. Around town, the signs were obvious. Chimneys smoked nonstop as furnaces worked overtime. Heating bills climbed higher than anyone wanted to admit. People walked slower, shoulders hunched, faces tight with fatigue. Conversations shortened. Smiles became rare. Winter had worn them down to essentials. And still, the storms kept coming. One hit mid-month that people would talk about for years. It began as snow, thick and wet, the kind that clung to everything it touched. By nightfall, the wind picked up, driving it sideways, forcing it into corners and seams. By morning, the temperature dropped sharply, freezing everything solid. Snow turned to ice. Ice turned to weight. Roofs groaned under the pressure. Across town, ladders appeared again, even though everyone knew how dangerous they were now. Snow had fused into hard slabs, slick on the surface and dense underneath. Clearing it took strength and time most people no longer had. But leaving it was an option. Not anymore. One house down the road lost part of its porch roof that morning. It did. Collapse entirely just enough to crack and sag, enough to remind everyone how close the line was. Another family discovered water stains creeping across their ceiling, slow and dark, the result of melting snow that had nowhere to go. Fear spread quietly. At his place, the barn roof did what it had been doing all winter. Snow hit it, paused briefly, then slid away. Ice never had time to form. Weight never had time to accumulate. The structure remained unchanged, steady, silent. What had once looked excessive now looked intentional. People noticed something else too. While others battled ice dams along their eaves, long frozen ridges that trapped meltwater and forced it back under shingles, his place had none. The barn roof intercepted snow before it ever reached the cabin roof. Meltwater drained cleanly away, far from the living space. There were no frozen gutters, no dripping icicles, no hidden damage waiting to be discovered in spring. Inside, the difference felt even more dramatic. February nights were brutal. Temperatures dropped so low that houses creaked loudly, wood contracting under stress. People slept in layers, adding blankets, still waking to cold rooms and numb toes. He slept through the night without interruption. The cabin stayed steady, insulated not just by walls and roof, but by the calm space above it. Heat lingered instead of vanishing. Cold stayed outside, trapped where it belonged. He woke rested while others woke worn down. At the diner, the tone shifted again. January had brought curiosity. February brought something closer to acceptance. People stopped questioning whether his setup worked. Now they wanted to understand why it worked so well. Hasn't he been on his roof once? Someone said, voice low, almost reverent. Not even after that storm. Another replied. A man who spent the morning chipping ice off his gutters shook his head slowly. I nearly fell off my ladder today, he said. Thought that was it. Silence followed. That silence carried weight. A few people began stopping by openly now, no longer pretending it was casual curiosity. They stood in his yard, boots sinking into snow where it piled safely away from the cabin, and looked up. They asked about the pitch, the spacing, the height. They asked how much snow it could take, how much wind it caught, how much it had cost. He answered patiently. He explained that it wasn't about strength alone. Strength resisted winter. This design avoided it. Snow did. T need to be supported if it was never allowed to stay. Wind did. T need to be blocked if it was guided over and away. Heat did. T need to be forced if it was allowed to settle naturally. Some nodded thoughtfully. Others frowned, trying to reconcile the explanation with everything they'd ever been taught. Old habits were hard to loosen, especially ones built on generations of doing things the same way. The storm that followed was worse. It arrived late at night, unannounced, heavy snow falling straight down in thick, wet clumps. By morning, the town was buried again. Plows struggled. Cars disappeared. Doors froze shut. The weight of it all pressed down on everything man-made. That morning, a roof on the far side of town partially collapsed. No one was hurt, but the damage was severe. The news spread quickly, not with drama, but with quiet dread. Everyone imagined their own roof next. People worked all day, exhausted and afraid. Snow fell faster than they could clear it. Ice formed beneath fresh layers, turning every step into a risk. Winter felt endless. At his place, snow slid. That was all it did. It landed. It moved. It left. He stood at his window for a long moment, watching it happen again and again, not with pride, but with something closer to gratitude. He hadn't outsmarted winter. He'd simply respected it enough to step aside. By now, even the most stubborn skeptics had stopped dismissing his idea. They did all like it. Some still thought it looked strange, excessive, even ugly, but none of them laughed anymore. Laughter had no place here now. Instead, there was calculation. People measured their own roofs with their eyes. They imagined snow loads, thought about past close calls, remembered nights spent listening for creaks that meant danger. They wondered how many winters they'd risked injury or worse simply because that's how it always been done. February dragged on, slow and punishing. Cold deepened. Snowbanks grew taller. But the barn over the cabin stood unchanged, doing the same quiet work every day. By the end of the month, something important had shifted. A structure was no longer a curiosity or a joke. It had become a reference point. When people talked about snow load, they pointed toward it. When they complained about shoveling, they mentioned it. When they worried about roofs, they thought of it. Winter had delivered its verdict, and it hadn't been kind to anyone who underestimated it, except the man who built a roof that refused to fight it at all. March crept in quietly, the way it often did after a brutal February, like winter catching its breath without actually leaving. The calendar said spring was near, but no one trusted it. Around here, March was a trickster. Snowstorms still arrived unannounced, and cold nights lingered stubbornly. People did relax, they just grew tired in a different way. Exhaustion replaced fear, a dull weariness that settled deep after months of fighting the same battle every day. By now, everyone felt it. Roof clearing had become less frequent, not because it once needed, but because people were running out of strength. Snow sat heavier than ever, compacted and icy, fused into thick slabs that resisted tools and patience alike. Some roofs looked misshapen under the weight, sagging just enough to make their owners uneasy. Others leaked in slow, quiet ways, damage hidden behind insulation and drywall, waiting for warmer days to reveal itself. And still, the barn over the cabin stood unchanged. From the road, the contrast had grown almost surreal. Snowbanks towered like walls around houses, pressed up against doors and windows. Icicles hung thick and long, catching what little sunlight appeared. At his place, snow lay where it was meant to lie away from the structure, sloped gently at the base of the barn posts, forming neat, predictable mounds. The cabin itself looked untouched, almost sheltered in a pocket of calm. People had stopped counting storms. They measured winter now by how tired they felt when they woke up. At the diner, conversation drifted into quieter territory. Complaints turned into confessions. People talked about how close they'd come to falling, how they'd heard something shift in the night, and laid awake listening. Someone admitted they'd stopped clearing the roof altogether and were just hoping for the best. Hope by March felt thin. Someone else finally said what had been circling everyone as thoughts. I wish I'd built something like that. No one laughed. That sentence would have been unthinkable a few months earlier. Now it landed softly, accepted without argument. Heads nodded. Coffee cups paused midair. People stared out the window, imagining what winter might have been like if they hadn't. T spent it fighting gravity with shovels and ladders. The first person to ask him directly came on a gray afternoon, the sky low and heavy, snow threatening but not yet falling. The man walked up the cleared path, slowly, boots sinking into snow that was already losing its crisp edge. He did T joke. He did T circle the topic. He stood there, looking up at the barn roof, then back at him. I don't want to shovel my roof anymore, he said. The honesty of it caught him off guard, just a little. There was no pride in the statement, no embarrassment either, just fatigue. They talked for a while. Not in technical terms at first, but in shared experiences. Close calls, long winters, the quiet fear of hearing a roof creak under weight. Only later did the questions turn practical. How tall? How steep? How far apart the posts? How much space between roofs? He answered everything as plainly as he could. Word spread quickly. Not as gossip this time, but as information. People compared notes. They walked past his place deliberately now, stopping to look, pointing out details to one another. The barn roof had become a kind of living diagram, a full-scale example of a different way to handle winter. Some people still resisted the idea. It looked expensive. It looked excessive. It looked like admitting they'd been wrong for years. That was harder than lifting a shovel. But resistance was thinning. March brought a wet snowstorm that pushed many people to their limit. The snow fell heavy and damp, clinging stubbornly to every surface. Clearing it felt like lifting concrete. Roofs that had been barely holding on now carried fresh weight, pressing down on already stressed structures. A few people did even try to clear them anymore. They watched nervously instead. At his place, the barn roof shed the snow almost immediately. Wet or dry did matter. The pitch and surface worked the same. Snow never stayed long enough to turn into ice. Water never backed up. Weight never accumulated. That storm broke something not in wood or shingles, but in mindset. A small group of neighbors gathered at his place one evening, standing under the barn roof as snow slid harmlessly away above them. They did need to speak much. The proof was overhead, audible in the soft rush of falling snow. For the first time all winter, they stood without shivering, without watching the sky anxiously. They asked deeper questions now, about airflow, about how the space above the cabin changed temperature, about why the structure stayed so quiet during high winds. He explained that wind wanted smooth paths, not resistance. That cold pooled where it was allowed to settle. That winter punished surfaces that held on to snow and spared those that let it go. Someone muttered almost to themselves, "We've been doing it backwards." That idea lingered. As March dragged on, small signs of thaw appeared. Not warmth exactly, but softness. Snow lost its sharp edges. Ice began to dull. Drips appeared during the day, then froze again at night. This was the most dangerous time for roofs. Heavy snow mixed with meltwater, refreezing in all the wrong places. Ice dams formed everywhere, gutters clogged with frozen sludge. Water backed up under shingles and seeped inside walls. People discovered stains spreading across ceilings, plaster sagging under moisture. Repairs were impossible now. All anyone could do was wait and hope damage did to get worse. At his place, there were no ice dams. The barn roof kept snow from ever reaching the cabin roof, and what little meltwater formed drained far away from the living space. The structure stayed dry, clean, intact. Spring-s approach made the difference even more obvious. As days lengthened, people started to inspect the damage winter had done. Shingles cracked by ice, warped fascia, rot beginning where moisture had lingered unseen. Winter revealed its costs slowly but relentlessly. He found none of that. The barn over the cabin hadn't just prevented work. During winter it had prevented damage that would have lasted years. The realization hit people hard. Shoveling wasn't just exhausting, it had been masking a deeper problem. They weren't winning against winter. They were barely holding it at bay. By late March, plans began to form. People talked about next year, not with dread, but with intention. They discussed changes, additions, redesigns. Some mentioned building overhangs. Others talked about secondary roofs, steeper pitches, air gaps. The barn over the cabin had sparked something more than admiration. It had sparked imagination. He watched all of this quietly. He hadn't built the structure to inspire anyone. He built it to survive winter without injury, without fear, without exhaustion. That it had become a reference point was something he accepted with mild surprise. The laughter from autumn felt distant now, almost unreal. Those memories softened into something gentler, less sharp. People did apologize outright. They did need to. Their questions, their attention, their changed tone said everything. As March bled into early April, snow finally began to retreat for good. Roofs emerged battered and scarred. Lawns reappeared unevenly. The town looked tired but relieved. Winter loosened its grip at last. His place emerged almost unchanged. The barn roof stood as it had all winter, solid and unmarked. The cabin beneath it showed no signs of stress, no hidden wounds waiting to surface. While others faced repairs, insurance calls, and long to-do lists, he simply opened windows and let fresh air in. People noticed that too. What he had built was just a shelter from snow. It was time. Time not spent shoveling, time not spent worrying, time not spent fixing damage that never had a chance to occur. By the time spring truly arrived, the barn over the cabin was no longer strange. It was simply there, a quiet answer to a question people had never thought to ask before winter forced them to. And as they looked ahead to the next cold season, many of them knew one thing for certain. They would never look at snow, or roofs, or winter itself the same way again. April arrived unevenly, like it always did, dragging winter behind it even as it promised something better. Snow did, to vanish all at once. It retreated in patches, pulling back from sunny spots and clinging stubbornly to shaded corners. The ground softened slowly, reluctantly, releasing months of cold a little at a time. Water ran everywhere along roads, through yards, down driveways, carrying with it the evidence of what winter had done. This was the season of reckoning. People climbed ladders again, not to shovel now, but to inspect. They checked shingles, flashing gutters. They tapped at boards that felt softer than they should have. They peered into attics and crawl spaces, searching for stains, warped wood, and the dull sheen of moisture where none should be. Spring did, to just bring relief. It brought answers. Some of them were unpleasant. Across town, damage revealed itself in quiet, discouraging ways. A ceiling bowed where ice dams had forced water backward. Insulation clumped and sagged, heavy with absorbed moisture. Nails rusted. Fascia boards showed dark streaks where meltwater had lingered too long. Roofs that had survived structurally still bore scars, cracked shingles, loosened seams, small failures that would demand time and money to fix. People talked about it constantly now. At the hardware store, conversations revolved around repairs instead of preparation. Which sealant worked best? How much replacement shingles cost this year? Whether insurance would cover slow leaks discovered months too late. Winter was over, but it was still collecting payment. At his place, the inspection took less than an hour. He climbed up once, slowly, carefully, more out of habit than concern. The barn roof looked exactly as it had in the fall. No sagging, no cracked panels, no loosened fasteners. Snow had come and gone without leaving a mark. Beneath it, the cabin roof was dry, clean, unchanged. No stains, no rot, no hidden damage waiting to reveal itself later. He climbed down and stood there for a moment, hands on hips, breathing in damp spring air. For the first time since autumn, he felt something close to closure. The experiment, though he never thought of it that way, was complete. Others noticed. Neighbors began stopping by with a different energy now. Not curiosity, not skepticism, but evaluation. They walked slowly around the structure, looking up, touching posts, measuring distances with their eyes. Some brought notebooks. One man brought a tape measure, using it without apology. No one joked anymore. They asked practical questions now, about cost, about time, about what he would change if he did it again. He answered honestly. It hadn't been cheap, but it hadn't been outrageous either. It had taken time, but no more than constant repairs would have over years. As for changes, there were always refinements, but the core idea had proven itself exactly as he hoped. What surprised him most was their interest. It was their tone. They spoke with humility. People admitted things openly now, that they were tired of winter injuries, that they'd nearly fallen more than once, that they'd spent too many nights listening for creaks, wondering if this would be the year something gave way. Winter had stripped away bravado. What remained was honesty. One afternoon, a neighbor who had laughed the loudest back in autumn stood beneath the barn roof, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked up for a long time before speaking. I did think you were wrong, he said slowly. I thought you were crazy. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just reflection. He nodded. That is fair. The man let out a breath, almost a laugh, but quieter than before. Turns out Crazy was fighting snow with a shovel every year. That sentence marked something important. Not a victory, but a shift. The community wasn't just accepting the idea anymore, they were reframing their own choices in its light. Spring progressed, and with it came the annual ritual of cleanup. Snowbanks melted into muddy heaps, lawns emerged flattened and pale. Fences leaned where frost had shifted posts. Everywhere, people worked to undo winter's impact. His workload was lighter. There were no repairs waiting, no leaks to trace, no damaged wood to replace. While others balanced on ladders and crawled through attics, he focused on smaller tasks, clearing debris, airing out the cabin, planning for planting. Winter had left him energy instead of debt. That difference did go unnoticed. By late April, a few neighbors had begun sketching designs of their own. Not exact copies, people rarely went that far, but variations inspired by what they'd seen. Secondary roofs, extended overhangs, steeper pitches, air gaps. The barn over the cabin had opened a door, and people were stepping through it cautiously, thoughtfully. One family hired a contractor to build a large snow-shedding cover over their porch and entryway. Another reinforced their roof with a steeper section designed to dump snow away from critical areas. Small changes, but deliberate ones. They did credit him loudly. They did need to. The influence was obvious. Conversations shifted again. Now they were about next winter, not with dread, but with planning. People talked about what they change, what they improve, what they never do again. Winter had stopped being an unavoidable punishment and started looking like a design problem that could be addressed. He listened more than he spoke. Looking back, the laughter from autumn felt distant, softened by time and shared experience. No one apologized outright. No one needed to. Survival had a way of equalizing people. Winter had humbled everyone differently, but equally. One evening, as the sun lingered longer than it had in months, a small group gathered near his place, standing in the shadow of the barn roof. The structure looked different in spring light, less imposing, more purposeful. What once seemed oversized now looked proportionate, balanced. Someone asked him if he planned to use the barn for anything else. Storage, equipment, animals. Maybe someday, he said. For now, it is doing its job. And that was true. The barn hadn't just sheltered the cabin. It had shifted the rhythm of his life for an entire season. Winter hadn't dictated his days. He hadn't measured time in shovels or storms. He lived inside it without being consumed by it. That realization settled slowly. As April faded into May, the ground dried. Grass began to green. Roofs baked under mild sun for the first time in months. Repairs wrapped up. Insurance claims closed. Winter finally loosened its grip entirely. The barn over the cabin remained unchanged, waiting. People passed it now without slowing as much. It had become part of the landscape, no longer a spectacle. But every now and then someone would glance up at it, thoughtful, remembering how different the past months could have been. He noticed those glances. One afternoon, alone again, he stood beneath the structure and listened. No snow slid now, no wind howled, just quiet. He thought about the winters ahead, about how the barn would stand through them doing the same simple work over and over, no drama, no struggle. He hadn't built something impressive. He built something enduring. And in a place where winter ruled for half the year, endurance mattered more than anything else. By the time the next autumn rolled around, people noticed the change before the first snow ever fell. It wasn't in the weather, or the color of the trees, or the way the mornings sharpened again. It was in the town itself, in the way conversations drifted, in the way people looked at their houses not with the casual confidence they once had, but with a more thoughtful eye. Winter was no longer an abstract idea. It had a memory now. Leaves piled up along fences and ditches, and nights grew cold enough to say your breath again. People brought out ladders, not to climb yet, but to inspect. They checked roofs earlier than usual, repaired what they could, reinforced weak spots they'd ignored for years. And almost without realizing it, many of them compared what they saw to the structure standing quietly over his cabin. The barn was unchanged. Summer had passed beneath it without consequence. Rain had come and gone. Windstorms had rattled trees and snapped branches, but the structure hadn't, complained. It looked exactly as it had in spring, solid, calm, waiting. Some people admitted it openly now. The barn had become their mental measuring stick. When someone talked about snow load, they gestured vaguely in its direction. When they discussed roof angles, airflow, ice dams, they referenced it indirectly. You know, like that setup he has. The sentence didn't need explanation anymore. Everyone knew what it meant. He noticed the shift most clearly when the first frost arrived. In years past, the first frost brought jokes. Talk of winter coming, delivered with forced humor. This time, there was less laughter and more quiet planning. Firewood was stacked earlier, gutters were cleaned thoroughly. A few people even built temporary covers or added angled panels to help shed snow from problem areas. Winter had taught them something, and they were listening. The first snowfall came late one evening, light and cautious. By morning, the town was dusted white, the way it always was at the beginning. People stepped outside to look, to feel the air, to test the season as mood. Shovels stayed inside. No one rushed. It was too early for that. At his place, snow landed on the barn roof, paused, then slid off gently, just as it had the year before. It felt almost familiar now, reassuring. He watched it for a moment, then went inside and went on with his day. What struck him most was how little he thought about it. Last year, every snowfall had been an event, something to monitor, to prepare for, to react to. Now, snow had become background, present, yes, but no longer demanding attention. That alone felt like a kind of freedom. As winter settled in again, the town followed a different rhythm than it used to. People still shoveled, still complained occasionally. Winter was winter, after all, but there was less panic, less frantic scrambling after storms. Fewer ladders appeared on roofs in the early weeks. People paced themselves. And they watched. They watched his place through the early storms, noting how little changed. They noticed that even when snow fell heavy and wet, the barn roof handled it without fuss. They noticed that ice never formed where it shouldn't. They noticed that his place remained quiet while others creaked and groaned. But something else changed too. No one waited for him to fail anymore. The expectation of collapse, of vindication, had vanished. Winter had already delivered its verdict the year before, and it hadn't. Tea needed to repeat itself. This season was tea about proving anything. It was about confirmation. Midway through December, after a long, steady snowfall, a neighbor stopped by. Not to ask questions this time, not to inspect, just to stand for a moment beneath the barn roof, watching snow slide away above them. "It is strange," the neighbor said. "Last year I hated this sound. Snow moving, always thought it meant trouble." He listened as another sheet of snow whispered down the slope and vanished into the growing pile below. "Now it sounds like relief," the neighbor continued. That observation stayed with him. Winter moved on, bringing storms and cold as it always did. But something fundamental had shifted. Snow still fell. Cold still bit. Yet the season no longer felt like an adversary to be beaten into submission. It felt more like a force to be guided, respected, and left to pass overhead. By January, it was clear that the town had learned more than just a building lesson. People helped each other more readily now. Roof clearing became a shared effort rather than a solitary risk. Someone would hold a ladder while another worked. Someone else would spot from below. The quiet fear of winter injuries had softened into collective caution. Design had changed behavior. The barn over the cabin hadn't. He just altered one man, as experience of winter had altered the town's relationship with it. People talked more openly about limits, about safety, about choosing smarter paths instead of harder ones. Pride had loosened its grip. He saw it one afternoon when a group of neighbors stood together, discussing a new structure one of them planned to build. They argued angles, airflow, snow paths, not with competitiveness, but with collaboration. The conversation felt different from anything he remembered before. Winter had forced humility. The barn had given permission to act on it. As the season wore on, he continued his quiet routine. He still split wood, still checked on things after storms. He was tea careless. He was simply no longer burdened. Snow did what snow did. He let it. On the coldest nights, when wind howled and temperatures plunged, he lay awake sometimes, listening not for danger, but out of habit. The barn absorbed the noise. Wind flowed over it smoothly, losing its bite before it reached the cabin. The structure did tea creak. It did tea complain. It stood like a promise kept. That steadiness mattered. By late February, when fatigue usually peaked, people were noticeably less worn down than the year before. Winter was still difficult, but it wasn't breaking them in the same way. Fewer injuries. Fewer emergency repairs. Less quiet desperation. The barn over the cabin had become proof that endurance won to just about toughness. It was about foresight. When spring finally returned again, it felt lighter this time. Not because winter had been kinder, but because it had been handled better. Snow melted. Water ran. Damage what little there was revealed itself. His place emerged, once again, unchanged. No leaks. No repairs. No surprises. Standing beneath the barn roof one evening, listening to water drip softly as snow retreated, he realized something important. The laughter from that first autumn no longer mattered, neither did the skepticism or the eventual admiration. What mattered was the quiet shift that had taken place inside himself and around him. He hadn't built a spectacle. He hadn't built a statement. He'd built a way through winter that did require suffering. And once people saw that such a thing was possible, they could unsee it. The barn over the cabin would stand for years, maybe decades, doing the same simple work again and again. Snow would fall. Snow would slide. Life beneath it would continue uninterrupted. In a place shaped by long winters, that was more than clever design. It was a lesson.